The book of Revelation is saturated with exotic imagery. This imagery is known in scholarly circles as apocalyptic. And this was actually the way of thinking of the times in which the book of Revelation was written. Now, in order to understand the bizarre imagery of the book of Revelation, we need to place ourselves in the shoes of those who received this book originally. You see, they didn't think as we do in the 21st century. They actually had a totally different framework of thought. They were used to understanding things in symbols, in graphic illustrations, in metaphors, in similes. And so we must jump into their skin, so to speak, in order to understand this imagery of Revelation, and particularly chapter 17, which is our study today. Now, Revelation 17 is perhaps the most complex chapter in the book of Revelation, and the most intellectually challenging. It contains vivid symbols and strange expressions. It's like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, where each symbol in the chapter is a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Now, in order to put the puzzle together, we must analyze each one of the pieces and see how they fit within the puzzle. Now, fortunately, Revelation chapter 17 not only contains a vision, but it also contains the interpretation of the vision. Actually, the vision proper is found in verses 1 through 8. And the interpretation of the vision is found in verses 9 through 18. Now, allow me to cover three preliminary things before we actually get into the study of chapter 17. And we've given handouts for everybody to fill in the blanks as we go along in our study. The handout is composed of 10 pages. Of course, we're not going to be able to finish all 10 pages in this lecture, but in our next one, we will conclude this very important subject. Now, the three preliminary points that I want to cover are these. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us that the book of Revelation was signified to John. Now, what that means is that the book of Revelation is written in sign language. In other words, it's not written in matter-of-fact, everyday language. It's written in symbols and signs and metaphors, and we must decipher these signs or these symbols or metaphors. So from the very beginning of the book, we find that the book of Revelation was signified, or it presents the message in symbols. The second point that I would like to deal with by way of introduction is that in order to understand the book of Revelation, or any other part of the Bible for that matter, we need to have wisdom. In fact, in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 9, we have the declaration that the only way to understand this chapter is by having wisdom. It says there in verse 9, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." So we're told here that there needs to be a mind which has wisdom in order to understand the symbols of this chapter. Now, in James chapter 1 and verse 5, we find that wisdom comes only from God. And so we need to sit down and we need to pray to God that He will give us understanding in this chapter. I must say that as I've studied this chapter throughout the years, I've had to stop in my study and pray when I get to an impasse or to a place where I can't understand a certain symbol or a certain expression. The third point that I would like to deal with by way of introduction is the fact that this vision of Revelation 17 was actually given by one of the 7 angels who had the 7 last plagues. Now, we all know that in the book of Revelation we have 7 plagues. They're found in chapter 16. And we're told in chapter 17 that the angel which gives this vision of chapter 17 is actually one of the 7 who poured out the plagues. Now immediately we ask the question, which of the 7 angels comes back in Revelation 17 to explain this very, very complex chapter? Is it the first angel who poured out his bowl? Is it the third? Is it the fifth? Is it the 7th? Which angel is it? Well, as we study along, we're going to find that there's no doubt that the angel which comes to explain Revelation 17 and actually give the vision of this chapter is none less than the angel who poured out the 6th plague. And you say, how do we know that? Well, because in Revelation chapter 17, we're told that the harlot, in verse 1, the harlot sits upon many waters. In verse 5, the harlot is called Babylon. Now, let me ask you, which was the river upon which Babylon was seated? There's no doubt whatsoever that Babylon, ancient Babylon, was seated upon the river Euphrates. Now, the question is, if in Revelation chapter 17, this harlot, who is called Babylon, is seated on many waters, then we must go back to the 7 plagues and find out which angel had something to do with the river Euphrates, which is the river upon which Babylon sat. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the only plague which deals with the waters of the river Euphrates is the 6th plague of Revelation. So the angel of Revelation 17 who gives this vision and the explanation is none less than the angel who poured out the 6th plague. This is a critical detail, and we'll see the importance of it a little bit later on. Now, I would like to review 2 other points that we've studied in previous lectures in order to set the stage for what we're going to study from this chapter in our lecture today. First of all, we've already studied that there are 7 parts to the vision of Daniel 7, the vision of Revelation 12, and the vision of Revelation 13. I just want to review the sequence of powers in those chapters. Actually, all 3 of those chapters are parallel. First of all, we have a lion, which represents Babylon. Then we have a bear, which represents Medo-Persia. Then we have a leopard, representing Greece. Then we have a dragon beast, which represents Rome. So far, so good. 4 beasts: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and the Roman Empire. But then we notice that we have 3 other stages in these chapters. In actual fact, we're going to notice that Rome actually occupies 4 of these 7 stages. Now, the 4th beast, as I mentioned, is Rome. But then we find in the prophecy, particularly Daniel 7, verses 23 and 24, that dragon beast sprouts 10 horns. And now you have a dragon beast with 10 horns. That is stage number 5. And then we find that dragon beast with 10 horns gives his power, his throne, and his authority to the beast of Revelation 13. And so you have a 6th stage, which is the stage of this beast who rules 1,260 days or years, or also 42 months, as it says in Revelation chapter 13. And then, of course, this 6th power, which is papal Rome, receives a deadly wound. But then its deadly wound is healed, and this power rises to the epitome of world dominion again. That is stage number 7, or stage number 4 of Rome. So reviewing, we have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the Roman Empire divided into 10 kingdoms. Then we have the papacy, represented by the beast of Revelation 13. And finally, we have the 2nd stage of papal Rome when it resurrects from its deadly wound. And this is where Revelation chapter 17 comes in. Now, another point that I need to cover in order for us to understand this chapter, which is very complex, is to comprehend the ancient concept of river dragons. You see, I've seen illustrations of this scarlet beast of Revelation 17 that have been drawn by artists. And, you know, sometimes they make this beast with the body, say, of a calf or a bull, and they put the heads of bulls, and the 10 horns they distribute among the different heads. In other words, there's 2 horns on this head, and there's 1 horn on this one, and maybe another one over on this one, and so on. This depiction by artists totally ignores the ancient concept of what is known as the cosmic river dragon. Allow me to explain what this concept was, because it's fundamental for what we're going to study in our lecture today. The ancients believed that there was a cosmic river dragon which was at war with the gods. Obviously, this concept is based in polytheism. The Bible picks up the imagery, but it doesn't actually believe that this cosmic river dragon existed in real life like the ancients did. But anyway, the Bible takes this imagery. They believed that there was this cosmic river dragon. And the river dragon had 7 heads. And the 7 heads were actually 7 mountains. And they believed that the mountains, or the heads, spewed out water, and the water would come down the side of the mountain, it would go into the valley, and it would form a tortuous river that looks like the body of a serpent or the body of a dragon. In other words, the mountains were actually heads of the dragon, and the waters flowed from the heads or from the mountains down the side of the mountain, and they formed the body of the dragon. They formed the river, which as it wound, it looked like a serpent. And then, of course, they also had the concept that when the river was at flood stage, the river would actually go out of its borders, and they believed that this was the dragon beast sprouting wings, because if you look at the river from above, you see when it's at flood stage that the waters have come out of the river, and they look like the wings of a dragon. And so they had this concept of the river dragon. The idea that the 7 heads were 7 mountains. And by the way, we know that rivers originate in the mountains. So, you know, this is scientifically true, although we know that the heads are not the heads of dragons. But anyway, this was the concept. 7 mountains, 7 heads, the 7 heads spewing out waters, forming the river, which wound like the body of a serpent or of a dragon. And then when the dragon was at flood stage, when the river was at flood stage, it extended its wings and it flooded the land. Now, this concept forms the foundation for the understanding of Revelation chapter 17. Now, I would like to go to talk about 3 aspects of Revelation chapter 17, and today we're probably going to only cover 2 of them. First of all, we want to take a look at the harlot. Secondly, we want to take a look at this scarlet dragon, or this scarlet beast. And in the third place, we want to take a look at the 10 horns which are on the head of this dragon, at least on one of the heads of this dragon. Now, let's go in our Bibles to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1 and examine some details about the harlot, first of all. Now, it's interesting to notice that in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1, we're told that the main protagonist of this chapter is this harlot. It's not the scarlet-colored beast. It's not the 10 horns. They are not the main protagonists. The individual who moves everything in this chapter, the dangerous figure, in fact, in this chapter, is this harlot woman. She sits on the waters, we're going to notice. We're going to notice also that she sits on the dragon. She sits on the heads of the dragon. She gives wine to the nations. She sheds the blood of the saints. She has dominion over the kings of the earth. And she's actually finally hated by the kings and by the beast. She is the central figure in this chapter. Now, notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1. We're told there, "And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither. I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore, or harlot, that sitteth upon many waters." Now, immediately we ask the question, what does this harlot represent? Obviously, it's not a literal harlot. It's not a literal whore, which is the language used by the King James. It is a symbol. Now the question is, what does a woman represent in prophecy? Well, we've studied this many times before. A woman represents the church. A pure woman is a pure church. But here we have a harlot woman. This must represent a church which is in apostasy, a church which has gone astray from God. In fact, if you look up in Ezekiel 16, verses 15 and 16, by the way, this is in your handout, and you can fill out the space, you're going to discover that this text, as well as many others in Hosea, in Ezekiel 23, in the book of Jeremiah, many texts present apostate Israel as a harlot. In fact, God, on occasion, called Israel the great harlot. Now, Israel professed to be God's people, but they were in apostasy against God. And so God says, I'm no longer your husband. You rather have other husbands from the nations, spiritually speaking. Therefore, you have become a harlot. The point is that a harlot, this harlot of Revelation 17, represents apostate Christianity. A Christianity that professes to belong to Christ, but which has apostatized from Christ. Now, I want you to notice what the apostasy involves in verse 2. It says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. And then it speaks about the wine. We'll come back to that later. But notice that one of the great sins of this harlot is that she has committed fornication with the kings. In other words, she has committed adultery with the kings. Instead of having a monogamous relationship with the Lord, she has illicit relationships with the kings of the earth. Now, what this means, simply, is if the harlot represents apostate religion, then her fornication with the kings of the earth must mean that she joins church and state. In other words, she joins religion and politics. She tries to get the state to do what only Jesus Christ should do. In other words, she has illicit political relationships with the kings of the earth. Now, the next point that I want us to notice is that this chapter several times speaks about this harlot sitting. In fact, you'll notice in verse 1, we already read it, that she sits on many waters. In Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, we notice that she sits on a scarlet-colored beast. In fact, it says there, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast. Now you say, now Pastor, wait a minute. You just read that she's seated on many waters. Now you say that she's seated upon a scarlet beast. Well, it's not me saying it. It's the Bible that's saying it. The fact is that it means the same thing. You say, how is that? Well, as we've noticed in the ancient concept, the body of this dragon beast was actually the body of a dragon. And so the waters, being the body of the dragon, it can be said that the harlot sits on the waters or she sits on this scarlet beast. And by the way, the reason why this scarlet beast, the waters, the body of the scarlet beast, are red is because in verse 6 we're told that she's full of the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. In other words, the waters are red. The body of the dragon is red because this harlot sheds the blood of God's people. She's also said to sit on the 7 mountains. Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 9. And here is a mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. In actual fact, the mountains are the heads of the dragon. The waters are the body of the dragon. So these 3 ways of speaking refer to the same thing. Seated on the heads, seated on the scarlet beast, seated on the waters, all refer to the same thing. In other words, she sits upon the beast, the waters, and the mountains. Now the question is, what does it mean that she sits? Well, in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 18, we find the meaning of her sitting. It says there in verse 18, and the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. In other words, she has dominion over the waters. She has dominion over this beast. She has dominion over the kings. In other words, she controls this dragon beast, this scarlet dragon beast. Now let's notice a few more things about the waters. We're told in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1 that she is seated on many waters. Let's read that again. At least the last half of the verse says, "Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." Now, these are not literal waters. This is Babylon. This is the river Euphrates, because Babylon was seated on the Euphrates. But this is not talking about literal H2O. This is talking in symbolic language. Now, let's notice, according to Revelation 17 and verse 15, what these waters represent. We're told there in verse 15, "And he said unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." Very interesting. In other words, the body of the dragon represents multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. The heads, or the mountains, we're going to notice, represent kingdoms, the kingdoms that rule over these peoples. And of course, the harlot represents apostate religion, which controls the multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples, and which controls the different kingdoms throughout history and controls these 10 kings at the very end of time. Now, it's interesting to notice that in Isaiah chapter 17, in verses 12 and 13, we're not going to look that up, but I'll just share it with you. According to the prophet Isaiah, the nations make noise like the noise of the sea, and a rushing like the rushing of many waters. So in other words, nations and multitudes are compared with the sea. They are compared with the rushing of many waters. Now, allow me to say a few things, a few additional things about these waters. Actually, we're going to discover in our study that these waters, the body of the dragon, are actually dried up 3 times. They actually rage and flood 3 times, and they are dried up 3 times. Let's go in our Bibles to Revelation chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 15. This is the first stage where this river is actually flooding. It says there in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 15, "And the serpent," by the way, this serpent is the dragon, and he has 7 heads. We won't go into reading that right now. You can notice it in verses 1 through 5. It says, "And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood." So notice, this is the river at flood stage. This is the body of the dragon at flood stage. The flood wants to destroy and kill the woman, wants to kill the church, the pure woman, according to Revelation 12 and verse 1. But then I want you to notice that the waters are dried up, or they're swallowed up. Notice verse 16. "And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth." Do you see this idea, this ancient concept of the dragon spewing water out of his mouth? By the way, his mouth is on the head, and that dragon beast has 7 heads. So you notice this ancient concept of mountains or heads spewing out water, and the water forming the body of the dragon, and that body of the dragon, those waters wanting to flood and wanting to destroy God's people. But it says here that when the serpent casts out waters like a flood to drown the woman, the earth comes, swallows up the waters, and the waters dry up. By the way, the serpent did this for 1,260 years. You can notice that in Revelation 12 and verse 14, and also Revelation 12 and verse 6. This is the period of the 1,260 years, the period of papal dominion. But then I want you to notice that after a period where the waters are dried up, that means that the heads are no longer sending their multitudes to try and destroy God's people. After a period of respite, suddenly the dragon begins spewing out waters again and persecuting and trying to destroy. Notice verse 17. "And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. See, the dragon is going to persecute again. The waters are going to begin to flow again after the earth swallows up the waters and persecution ceases. Now, this is the same picture which is presented in Revelation chapter 13. Once again, you have there a beast who comes from the sea, and according to verse 7, this beast actually rules for a period of 42 months. Let's notice that. Actually, it's verse 5, and it says, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And then notice verse 7 that I mentioned a few moments ago, "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations." So notice that for 42 months, this beast persecutes God's people. Just like in chapter 12, this dragon spewed water out of his mouth for 1,260 days. Both chapters are speaking about the same time period. But then we find that after this beast, for 42 months, persecutes God's people, suddenly something happens to this beast. Notice what we find in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10. Speaking about this beast, at the end of the 1,260 years, it says, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." In other words, this beast, which is persecuting God's people for 42 months, at the end of the 42 months receives a deadly wound. That's the same as the drying up of the waters in Revelation 12, after the dragon spews out waters for 1,260 years. But do you remember that in Revelation chapter 12, after the waters were swallowed up by the earth, we're told that then the dragon was enraged with the woman, and once again he's flooding and he's going to make war? Revelation 13 presents the same scenario. Notice verse 3. It says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." Do you see the parallel here between Revelation 12 and Revelation 13? In Revelation chapter 12, you have this dragon beast spewing out waters to try and destroy the woman, to drown the woman. And this happens for 1,260 days. Then we find that the earth swallows up the waters are dried up. After the waters are dried up for a while, the dragon is enraged and he goes to make war against God's people once again. Revelation 13, this beast persecutes for 42 months. At the end of the 42 months, it receives a deadly wound. It's the same thing as the drying up of the waters. And then its deadly wound is healed, and once again it persecutes. This is parallel to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. Now, some people wonder whether this beast was actually wounded or not to death. Some people say, well, he was only wounded, but he wasn't killed. The fact is, there's no doubt whatsoever that this beast was killed at the end of the 42 months, or at the end of the 1,260 days or years. You say, how do we know that? Simply because the expression in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3, where it says, "I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death," is the identical expression that is used to refer to Christ as a lamb as though he had been slain. So if the expression "as though he had been slain" refers to the fact that Jesus was killed, and the same term is used for this beast also was killed at the end of the 42 months. Furthermore, we just read in verse 10 that it says that this beast must be killed with the sword. It doesn't say only wounded, it says killed with the sword. In other words, this beast actually was wounded to death. He not only was wounded to the point of death, but he was actually wounded to death. Now, I want you to notice that there is another time when the waters are going to flow again. Revelation chapter 12, 17 says the dragon, after the waters are swallowed up by the earth, says the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. This idea is picked up later in the book of Revelation. Only a different term is used. Notice Revelation chapter 16, Revelation chapter 16, and I want you to notice verse 12. Revelation 16 and verse 12. This is the sixth plague. I want you to notice, it says, and the sixth angel poured out his vial upon what? The great river Euphrates. Now let me ask you, what does Euphrates represent? We already noticed in chapter 17, it represents multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. What did the river Euphrates want to do before the waters were dried up? The waters were going to do the same thing that they were doing during the 1260 years, or during the 42 months. The waters wanted to drown God's people during that period. Revelation 16 tells us that the river Euphrates is going to flow again. In other words, multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples are going to come after God's people to try and destroy them. But let me ask you, is God going to dry up those waters again at the end of time like he did at the end of the 1260 years? Notice once again, verse 12. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was what? The water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And the kings of the east, of course, represent Jesus and his angels. Jesus coming in his second coming with the armies of heaven, or the angels. Notice once again that at the end of time, this raging river, which tried to drown the woman during the 1260 years, is going to flow again. By the way, this is that dragon beast, whose body is described as that river of multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. But when this river is about to drown and destroy God's people, just like happened at the end of the 1260 years, God is going to dry up that river. Now, I hope that you understood what I've gone through. This is of critical importance. Now, I mentioned that there's three dryings up of the river. I'm going to save the last drying up till the end of these two studies that we have. Now, I want you to notice what the name of this harlot is. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. She has a particular name. It says, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. So we discover that this harlot who sits on many waters is Babylon. That's how we know that the Euphrates of chapter 16 is connected with this chapter, because the river of Babylon was the Euphrates. Now I want you to notice another very interesting detail. Not only is she called Mystery, Babylon the Great, but we are told that she is the mother of what? She is the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now, I'd like to ask, how many of you have ever met a mother that does not have children? I know women who don't have children, but I haven't met the first mother who never had a child. Which means that this harlot has children or daughters, because she's the mother of harlots, feminine in this case. And so she has daughters that were born from her. So you notice that in this chapter we have actually a threefold alliance. We have an alliance between the harlot, the kings, and the daughters of the harlot. By the way, these three powers are spoken of in Revelation 16 as the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. By the way, the harlot represents the Roman Catholic system when it resurrects to power at the end of time. The daughters represent the Protestant denominations that were born from the Roman Catholic papacy in the 16th century. They teach many of the same doctrines that the mother does. And today they're trying to join church and state, just as the mother did during the 1260 years. And so we find in Revelation 17 a threefold alliance between the harlot, Roman Catholicism, between the daughters who were born from the Roman Catholic papacy, apostate Protestantism, and the kings of the earth and of the whole world. Now I want you to notice the name that this woman has on her forehead. It's found in Revelation chapter 17, Revelation chapter 17, and I want you to notice verse, let's see here. Let's begin at verse 3. It says, so he carried me away in the spirit in the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of what? full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. What are the names? The names are blasphemous names. Now the question is, what is blasphemy according to Scripture? Well, the fact is, folks, that we don't have to look far to find the biblical definition of blasphemy. Blasphemy is when a mere man claims to be God. You can find that in John 10, verses 30 to 33. In fact, that's in your handout. I hope you fill out that little space. Blasphemy is when a mere man claims to be God on earth. Jesus was accused of blasphemy because he made himself God. Of course, he was God. He had a right to say it. A mere man doesn't have that right. But the key point is that blasphemy is when a man claims to be God. The second nuance of blasphemy is found in Mark chapter 2 and verse 7. And it has to do with a mere man claiming to have the power to forgive sins. When a mere man claims that he can forgive sins, according to Mark 2 verse 7, this is blasphemy. So blasphemy is when a mere man claims to be God and when a mere man claims to have the power to forgive sins. Well, there's only one system in the world that claims these prerogatives, Christian system that is, and it's the Roman Catholic papacy. They have claimed throughout the centuries that the Pope is God on earth. And they have claimed also that their priesthood has the power to forgive sins, just like we find in this description in Revelation 17. And then I want you to notice the attire or the dress of this harlot. Notice verse 4. And the woman was arrayed, that means robed or dressed, in purple and scarlet color. Let me ask you, what does purple and scarlet represent? In Scripture, purple and scarlet represent royalty. They are the colors of a king. You can notice that, for example, it's in your handout, by the way, in texts such as Matthew 19 and verse 5, also Matthew 27:28. Jesus was garbed by his enemies in purple and in scarlet, and then they knelt before him and they said, let's worship this king. Obviously, they were doing it mockingly, but it's interesting that they dressed him in scarlet and purple. So that represents the fact that this system claims to have dominion or to rule over the kings of the earth. You'll also notice in the last half of the verse that it says that this system was decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. In other words, this is a very rich system that majors in gold and silver and precious stones and pearls. It is a system that has many of these types of riches within it. Of course, we don't have to look far to find the system which has all of these things in its cathedrals and in its churches. Gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls. Very, very rich system, according to Revelation 17. And then I want you to notice that there's something in the hand of this harlot. Once again, verse 4 says, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. And now notice this, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Now we have to stop here for a moment, and I need to make an explanation. Seventh-day Adventists have traditionally believed that wine in prophecy represents false doctrines. So I decided one day that I would go to a concordance and I would look up the word wine to try and discover if our traditional view is correct. And so I went to the concordance and I looked up every reference to the word wine. And to be honest with you, I couldn't find any clear reference that says that wine represents false doctrines or false teachings. Most of the references deal with literal wine. And so I said, I know that our traditional view is correct, and I know that the view of Ellen White is correct, because she explicitly states this, that wine represents false doctrines, and I'm going to read the statement in a few moments. I said, there's got to be some way that we can corroborate this in Scripture. And then one day I was reading verse 4 again, and I found the key. You notice that this cup has wine, but the wine is called something. Notice the last half of the verse. It says, having a golden cup in her hand, full of what? Of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. In other words, the wine is composed of her abominations. And so I said, well, maybe I better look up the word abominations. And I'll tell you that when I looked up the word abominations, I found an abundance of evidence that abominations or wine represent false practices and false doctrines. Now, for those of you who are following along in the handout, the golden cup contains the wine of Babylon, but the wine is identified as her abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And I want you to notice that the wine is given to all nations, that is to say, to all of the inhabitants of the earth. In other words, all of the nations and the inhabitants are made drunk with her wine. In other words, the waters upon which she sits, she gives wine to these waters, and these waters, or multitudes and peoples, are made drunk with her wine. Now, I want you to notice another very important detail, and that is that the drinking of this wine by the nations is not optional. It is actually obligatory. The harlot makes them drink. In fact, notice in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8, if you go with me there, this is actually the second angel's message. It says, and there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, now notice this, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Notice, she made all nations drink. This is talking about the fact that she's going to force all nations to drink her wine. Also in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2, we're told that all nations were made drunk by the wine of her fornication, the wine of the wrath of her fornication. In fact, you'll notice that several times in the book of Revelation, the wine is called the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, why would it be called the wine of the wrath of her fornication? Very simple. When the harlot gives wine to the kings, that's the heads, the mouths that spew out the waters, that tell the waters what to do. And when the harlot gives wine to the multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples, the result is that they are filled with wrath or with rage against those who do not want to drink the wine. In other words, that's the reason why it's called the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, what is this wine? We've already mentioned that the wine represents false doctrines. The wine is her abominations. Now, what are some of those abominations? I looked in the concordance. I said, I can't find anything under wine, but because the wine is called her abominations, let's look up the word abominations. And I discovered some very interesting things. And I'm just share these with you. They're in your handout, so you can fill them out. You can look up the verses. Idol worship is called an abomination before God. And of course, we know that the Roman Catholic system, the churches and the cathedrals are filled with idols that people bow before. Secondly, attempting to communicate with the dead and occult practices. Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 13, mentions several of these occult practices, the main one of which is to try and communicate with the dead. By the way, did you know that Roman Catholics pray to the saints and to Mary, who died? According to Scripture, these individuals that they venerate as saints, they're actually sleeping in the tomb. Another abomination, according to Scripture, Proverbs 28 and verse 9, is refusing to hear God's law. And we're told that the little horn thought that he could change God's holy law. In fact, he's called the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Spiritual fornication, in other words, the church becoming involved with the politicians of the world, with the state. In other words, getting involved in politics instead of having Jesus convert the hearts of people. Ezekiel 23, verses 35 to 45, speaks of spiritual fornication as an abomination. Deuteronomy 14, verse 3 says that eating unclean animals is an abomination to God. So anybody who teaches that you can eat pork and everything that God has said that we're not supposed to eat is practicing an abomination. Ezekiel 22 and verse 2 says that shedding innocent blood is an abomination. And we're told that this system during the Middle Ages slew the saints of the Most High, killed the saints of the Most High. And at the end of time, it says that she's going to be filled with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. In Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16, we're told that sun worship is an abomination. Now you're going to say, well, the Roman Catholic system does not worship the sun. Well, it might be true that they don't worship the sun, but if you've ever noticed, literally speaking, if you've ever noticed where they have the host, it has a huge sunburst. Their cathedrals are filled with suns. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church claims to have changed the day of worship from Sabbath to the day of the sun. And of course, Protestants follow right along in keeping the day of the sun. It's interesting, in the light of what I've shared with you, I've only shared some of the doctrines that are called an abomination. It's interesting to notice what Ellen White had to say about this wine. Her quotation is found in Testimonies to Ministers, pages 61 and 62, and I'm going to read it, even though it is quite an extensive quotation. She says this: "The fallen denominational churches are Babylon. Babylon has been fostering poisonous doctrines, the wine of error." Did you notice that? Poisonous doctrines, the wine of error. This wine of error is made up of false doctrines, such as the natural immortality of the soul, the eternal torment of the wicked, the denial of the pre-existence of Christ prior to his birth in Bethlehem, and advocating and exalting the first day of the week above God's holy, sanctified day. These and kindred errors, notice that it's not an exhaustive list that she gives, these and kindred errors are presented to the world by the various churches. And thus the scriptures are fulfilled that say, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." It is a wrath which is created by false doctrines. And when kings and presidents drink this wine of the wrath of her fornication, they are stirred with anger against those who will not come into harmony with the false and satanic heresies which exalt the false Sabbath and lead men to trample underfoot God's memorial. Now, it would be impossible to understand the meaning of Revelation 17 without comprehending that at every stage, this harlot has had a target of her enmity. The target has been always to annihilate God's people. In other words, this is a battle between the harlot, her daughters, and the kings of the earth against God's people. Allow me to mention several passages in the book of Revelation which depict this warfare. For example, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 13. God's people are called the woman. It says the serpent spewed water out of his mouth to drown the woman. So in other words, this dragon beast, instigated by this harlot, wants to drown the woman or God's people. In Revelation 12:17, we're told that the dragon is enraged with the remnant of the woman's seed. Of course, the woman's seed is Jesus. So she's enraged against the remnant of Jesus. In Revelation 13 and verse 7, we're told that this beast, which rules for 42 months or 1,260 days, we're told that she actually was able to prevail over the saints. In other words, she destroyed the saints of the Most High. And in Revelation 17 and verse 6, we are told that this woman is filled with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. In other words, this is a warfare against God's church. This system did it during the 1260 years. At the end of that period, a deadly wound was given. Persecution came to an end. But then the Bible tells us that her deadly wound is going to be healed. The waters are going to persecute again. And then under the sixth plague, the waters are going to be dried up by God once again. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now allow me to deal briefly with the moments that we have left with this seven-headed scarlet dragon. So far we've dealt with the harlot. Now let's talk about the dragon. Actually, in Revelation, we have 3 seven-headed beasts. And by the way, each of these seven-headed beasts represents a stage of Rome. First of all, we have a beast or a dragon beast in Revelation 12 and verse 1. This dragon beast tries to kill the child as soon as the child is born. By the way, this beast is battling in heaven. It's interesting to notice that each of these beasts is battling in a different place or rises in a different place. So it says that there's a sign in heaven, and this dragon beast wants to slay the child. That represents pagan Rome. But then you have a second seven-headed beast. And that beast is in Revelation 13 verse 1. And this beast rises from the sea and then rules 42 months. This represents another Rome. This represents papal Rome. And then finally, you have in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 8, you have a beast which arises from the abyss. Once again, has 7 heads and 10 horns. And of course, this beast, we're going to notice, this scarlet beast, represents Rome when its deadly wound is healed. It represents the healing of the wound of papal Rome. And so you have 3 separate beasts that are used to represent stages of Rome. You have the dragon beast, which is Rome, that tried to slay the child. The sign is seen in heaven. Then you have the beast that rises from the sea, and this beast persecutes for 1,260 years, or 42 months. And then you have a dragon beast, the scarlet beast of Revelation 17. The deadly wound of that second beast is healed, and now this beast rises from the abyss, and once again he goes to persecute God's people. Now the question is, why would this beast rise from the abyss? Well, we need to understand that the abyss in Scripture represents the place where the dead are. It's the place of the dead. In fact, notice what we find in Romans chapter 10 and verse 7, where this word abyss is used, where this dragon beast comes forth from. It says there, or who shall descend into the deep? And then it explains in parentheses, that is, to bring up Christ again from the dead. In other words, coming up from the deep means rising Jesus Christ from where? From the dead. So the deep is the place where the dead are. Now the question is, why would this dragon beast of Revelation chapter 17 arise from the abyss, which is the realm of death? It's very simple. You see, this beast was alive for 42 months. At the end of the 42 months, it received what? A deadly wound. It was killed. But in Revelation 17, what's going to happen? This beast is going to what? He's going to arise from the dead. His wound is going to be healed. And all of the world is going to wonder after the beast. By the way, this same word, abyss, is used in Revelation chapter 20 as the place where the devil is going to be bound during the 1,000 years. And we all know that during the 1,000 years, all of the wicked are going to be dead. In other words, it is the realm of the dead where Satan is bound during the 1,000 years. But Revelation 20 says that after the 1,000 years, all of the dead are going to what? They're going to rise. Where do they rise from? They rise from the deep, because the deep is the place of the dead. Now I want you to notice also that the 7 heads of this scarlet dragon beast represent, according to Revelation 17 and verse 10, they represent 7 kings. In fact, let's read that. It says in verse 10, and there are 7 kings. In other words, the 7 heads represent 7 kings. Now, we need to remember that in prophecy, kings and kingdoms are used interchangeably. They're not actually individual kings. They are actually 7 successive kingdoms. Allow me to give you an example or two. For example, in Daniel 7, verse 17, it says that the 4 beasts of Daniel 7, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the dragon beast, are 4 kings. But then later on, in verses 23 and 24, it says that this 4th beast represents a 4th kingdom. And so the 4 beasts are 4 kings, but the 4th beast is a 4th kingdom. So in other words, these kings are actually not individual kings, but they are kingdoms. God did the same with Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, 37 and 38. God said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, and after you will arise another kingdom. See? In other words, when it speaks about kings, it's actually referring to kingdoms. Now, I need to explain some things before we draw this to a close. We need to understand that some people have said that the first 2 heads of this scarlet dragon beast represent Assyria and Egypt. In fact, this is what they say. They say the 7 heads are these: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, papal Rome, and then it speaks about an 8th, they say resurrected papal Rome. Now, I want you to know that I don't agree with this point of view, and the reason is that in none of the lines of prophecy, Daniel 7, Revelation 12, Revelation 13, in none of them do you find Egypt and Assyria. All of them begin with Babylon, which means that the first head of this dragon beast must be in line with all of those previous prophecies, because this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Just like the beast of Revelation 13, just like the beast of Revelation chapter 12, and just like the dragon beast, although the dragon beast of Daniel 7 has only 1 head, it still has 10 horns. So in other words, putting Egypt and Assyria into the picture doesn't fit with the previous prophecies. Some people have interpreted it in a different way. They say that the 7 heads represent 7 popes, and you've probably heard this view. And we're going to find that it says that 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And so what they say is since 1929, when supposedly the deadly wound was healed, when, when Mussolini gave the Papal States back to the papacy, they say since 1929, when the deadly wound was healed, there have been, up till John Paul II, actually 6 popes. Let me mention them to you. You have, first of all, Pius XI from 1922 to 1939. You have Pius XII, who ruled from 1939 to 1958. John the 23rd from 1958 to 1963. Paul VI from 1963 to 1978. John Paul I, or the second, excuse me, John Paul I, who ruled only for a short period in 1978. That's 5. So they say 5 are fallen. 1 is, which would have been John Paul II. Of course, he's dead now. But when he was alive, they said, see, 5 have fallen since 1929. 1 is John Paul II, and the other one has not yet come. And when he comes, he's going to rule for a short time, and that's Benedict XVI. Now, I can't agree with this point of view either, because these 7 heads represent kingdoms, as we've studied. Furthermore, this comes pretty close to setting a date for end-time events, which is forbidden by the spirit of prophecy. Furthermore, we find very clearly in Scripture that Revelation 17 is connected with Revelation 13 and Revelation 12. To make Revelation 17 say that the 7 heads are actually 7 popes totally goes against the idea that the 7 heads in Revelation 13 and Revelation 12 represent 7 kingdoms. In other words, it disconnects Revelation 17 from Revelation 12 and Revelation 13. Furthermore, there's no evidence that the deadly wound was healed in 1929. It's true that the Papal States were returned to the papacy in 1929, but the deadly wound is only healed when the papacy once again has the sword to persecute God's people. The sword that gave the death wound to the papacy, which is the sword of the state, according to Romans chapter 13 and verse 4. When the papacy recovers that sword, which it had during the Middle Ages, with which it was wounded in 1798, when it recovers that sword and it is able to persecute again, then the deadly wound is healed. And by the way, for those who say that the deadly wound was healed in 1929, there's a big problem. And that is that the Papal States were returned to the papacy by Italy. But according to Revelation chapter 13, it is the United States which will be instrumental in healing the deadly wound of the papacy, not Italy. The United States will return the sword to the papacy, in other words. Now, our time is up for today. We have many more fascinating things to study. We still have to study about the 10 horns. It's fascinating to study about the 10 horns. They're on the heads of the 3 beasts, the beast of Revelation 12, the beast of Revelation 13, and the beast of Revelation 17. You know that all of these chapters are very closely related. But allow me to say, before we bring this to an end, that this beast of Revelation 17 has 3 stages of existence. Revelation 17 and verse 8 says that this beast was, by the way, that's during the 1260 years, is not, because this beast now has a deadly wound, and shall be, because the deadly wound is going to be healed. Verse 8 also says, it was and is not, and yet is, the King James Version says. A better translation would be shall be present. Notice 3 stages: was, is, and shall be. In Revelation 17 and verse 10, these same time periods are described as 3 are fallen. That's when it was. 1 is, that's the present. And the other is not yet come. This is when the deadly wound is healed. And it's expressed also differently in Revelation 17 verse 11, where it says that this beast was and is not, and he is even the 8th. Next time we'll discuss the issue